Hi students, it's Mr. Ramage. This video lesson is going to take us through the Declaration of Independence and talk about what's in the Declaration, how it connects to the American Revolution, and what parts of the Enlightenment philosophers' ideas find their way into Jefferson's writing. So we've been talking about the events leading up to the start of the American Revolution and the fighting that's going to take place. But as we are now fighting the British openly in the colonies, we're still not quite sure what we want yet. We're not really fighting for independence until we get to 1776. There were people who believed this was just a skirmish and we would remain part of the British Empire. We also have people who absolutely did not support the fighting and wanted to remain loyal to the empire. And then we had some people who are definitely in favor of independence that we're going to find mostly in our group of founding fathers. But just to provide some context leading up to the Declaration, Benjamin Franklin said, "We are no longer fascinated with the idea of a speedy reconciliation. We shall exert ourselves to some purpose. Till then, things will be done by halves." So Jefferson says, look, we are not going to reconcile with England. Things have gone too far. And until we actually decide what we want, we're only going to be doing things by half. And that's not good. When you're only doing things halfway, or with half energy, you're not going to be very successful. Eldridge Gerry in 1776 said, "Some timid minds are terrified at the word independence. America has gone such lengths she cannot recede, and I am convinced a few weeks or months at furthest will convince her of the fact, but the fruit must have time to ripen in some of the other colonies." So this tells us that from Gary's point of view, right, America was afraid of independence, but now it seems like more and more people are opening up to this idea. We cannot recede. We cannot go backwards. We can't go back. We've already started this. And that some people are maybe more ready than others for revolution. That some colonies must have time to ripen this fruit of revolution. That they're not quite there yet. In 1776, Englishman Thomas Paine's Common Sense is published, and that is going to go a very, very, very long way to convincing people to support the movement to independence. Common Sense is extremely popular throughout the colonies, and it's read by hundreds of thousands of people, those ideas discussed, and Paine's clear language and clear ideas about why independence is kind of the natural next step does go a long way to convincing many people. From the Pennsylvania Evening Post in February 1776, "Sometime past the idea of independence would have struck me with horror. I now see no alternative. Can any virtuous and brave American hesitate one moment in the choice?" From the New London Gazette from the colony of Connecticut in March of 1776, "We were blind, but on reading these enlightening works, the scales have fallen from our eyes. The doctrine of independence hath been in times past greatly disgustful. We abhorred the principle. It has now become our delightful theme and commands our purest affections. We revere the author and highly prize and admire his works." So again, we are seeing some warming up to the idea of independence. So by May of 1776, the Second Continental Congress begins debating this question of independence. And should we adopt such government as shall, in the opinion of the representatives of the people, best conduce to the happiness and safety of their constituents in particular, and America in general? So we're having the discussions openly now in the Continental Congress. On May 15th, Adams says, "It is necessary that the exercise of every kind of authority under the said crown should be totally suppressed, that there is no going back. We cannot still be under the rule of the British crown." Then on June the 7th, Richard Henry Lee stands up and proposes independence, officially brings it to the table, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from an allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them is to be totally dissolved. So Richard Henry Lee's resolution gets the ball rolling, and the formation of the Committee of Five. These are the 5 people who will be assigned to draft a Declaration of Independence based on Lee's proposal. And those guys are John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert J. Livingston, Benjamin Franklin, but the primary author, Thomas Jefferson, he will be the one that constructs the majority of the Declaration of Independence. He is from Virginia, He is young, and according to Franklin, he is a much better writer. On July 2nd, the Congress votes to approve Lee's resolution for independence. So it's actually not July the 4th, technically July the 2nd. But July 4th is the day that Congress votes to approve the wording of the Declaration of Independence. As we will see in a few minutes, there are some issues with some of the language that Jefferson includes in the Declaration. So what is in the Declaration of Independence? We are going to explore some of the different parts of the Declaration. Some you may be familiar with, but maybe others you're not. This is the opening. This is the introduction to the Declaration. This is probably a part that you've heard before, but this is an amazing sentence. And yes, it is one sentence. And it is probably one of the most important sentences in modern world history. Jefferson writes, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation." Well, that's pretty awesome. What exactly is he talking about? So what he's telling us here is a little introduction. Like any good paragraph or any good essay, the introduction tells us what you're going to tell us. And he says that one people have now begun to dissolve the political bands. Like in the course of history, one people, the colonists, to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, England, right? That we are going to dissolve our connections with England. And in the last part of that sentence, it says that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. That this declaration is going to explain the reasons for this separation. The next part is the preamble, or the philosophy statement. And this is probably the part that most people know, especially the first part. "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new governments, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." Now that's just pretty awesome and chock full of Enlightenment ideas. Jefferson is highly influenced by the Enlightenment philosophers when he writes the Declaration. He incorporates lots of Enlightenment ideas, especially the words and the ideas and the philosophies of John Locke. So in that first part, he mentions life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the natural rights identified by John Locke. His, though, of course, life, liberty, and property. We'll circle back to that word in a few minutes. And then he explains it so clearly, right? Like so simply in this paragraph, that all men deserve these rights, right? That we as colonists, we as people deserve to have these rights. And then he goes into an explanation of the social contract. This idea that to secure the rights, governments are instituted among men. That to protect these rights, we have government. That is the government's function, that is the government's purpose, and the government gets its powers from us, the people. We give them our consent. We give them our approval, our agreements that we will surrender some of our rights to empower the government to secure the rest of our rights. And if the government fails to do that, which in this case the British government has failed to do that, we then have the right as the people to have a revolution, to dissolve that government, to create a new government that will do its job and make the government work again. So within this preamble or philosophy statement, we hear lots of Enlightenment ideas focused around the concept of natural rights and the concept of the social contract. Very clearly, without any fanfare or extra things, Jefferson tells us these very directly, very specifically. Look, we have natural rights. Governments exist to protect those rights. When the government fails to do that, we have the right to create a new government. The body is the next portion of the Declaration, where Jefferson continues to describe the situation. We're not going to dive into the whole thing, but let's pull out a couple of phrases that are important. That governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. That we're not just doing this because we got mad a couple of days ago. This has been going on a long time, and we understand that, we shouldn't just change things because we're slightly unhappy. These are some serious issues that we've been dealing with for a long time. In the second paragraph, he says a long train of abuses and usurpations. That this is, again, there is lots of evidence that we have been treated poorly. This is a long list. I'm about to tell you about that list here in a minute. And he mentions the term absolute despotism, right? That the government has given us, has ruled over us with this power. The king is a despot. The British government is acting in ways that it shouldn't be. And then the third paragraph, he mentions the patient sufferance of these colonies, that we have endured these things for a very long time. We have been patient. We have made attempts to change things. Nothing has gotten better. Nothing has been changed. And then he focuses on the king. The king of Great Britain, George III, is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, that the king has done this consistently, and begins to lay the blame at the feet of the king, not Parliament, not the legislative body in England, but rather on the king's doorstep, having absolute tyranny over these states. And then we're going to list all the reasons why the king is guilty, why the king has done this. So the next and longest part of the Declaration is the grievance section. There are 27 grievances against the king, 27 things that we can identify over time that he has done to violate our natural rights, to abuse his power as the monarch. He has refused his assent to laws. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly. He has made judges dependent on his will alone. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. There's the big one. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. So this is a list of charges. This is almost like taking the king to court, where he would stand up before a judge and we would read the charges against him. 27 things that we accuse the king of doing, 27 things that provide the evidence to support this revolution. And then the final part is the conclusion and actual Declaration of Independence, which then announces to the world that we are, these united colonies, and of right ought to be free and independent states, and that they are absolved from any allegiance to the British crown, that we are the United States of America, and we are allowed to do what other countries can do, and that we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And we do this, again, with the consent of the people. We are doing this with their support. So let's summarize that breakdown. The Declaration begins with an introduction explaining that we are separating from England, and we're going to tell you why. The preamble explains natural rights, social contracts, and that it's okay to have a revolution, and we're completely justified in doing that. The body of the document talks about how we have tried to make it work, but it's just not happening, and the king has continued to treat us poorly despite our efforts to try to resolve the situation. The grievance section provides evidence against the king, explaining why we are declaring our independence. He has done all these things wrong to us. And then at the very end, the conclusion and declaration says that we are our own nation, free of England's control, and able to do all the things a sovereign nation should be able to do. Now, there was a grievance that was taken out of the Declaration. We're going to introduce this here and explore a little bit further as we move on. But there was a slavery grievance included by Jefferson in the Declaration, and you can see by the text on the screen that it is extremely long. It is the longest grievance that he wrote, with a lot of detail, and talking about the slave trade, that he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people. So it goes through and blames the slave trade and the existence of slavery in the colonies on the king. Now, we'll debate this a little bit later on, if the kings were really responsible for that. But Jefferson uses slavery as a reason to grieve against the treatment of the colonies. He also mentions at the end that the British had been using escaped slaves from the colonies to fight against the colonies. There's going to be a few thousand escaped slaves fighting on the side of the British because they promised them freedom afterwards. So, of course, people would go up and join the British to free themselves from bondage in the colonies. Again, a topic we'll discuss in some more detail later on, but it means that the Declaration presents this really interesting topic of using slavery as a reason for independence, as a grievance against the king. What makes it also interesting is that Jefferson was a slave owner who owned about 600 slaves during his lifetime. So as a slave owner, as a Southerner, as a Virginian, why would he include this? Again, we're going to discuss this at a later time, but it does provide a very interesting question. There's a lot of conflict in Jefferson, always has been. He has very strong ideas about freedom and equality and liberty, but he also has very strong ideas about people who are of African descent. He does not share beliefs that they are equal to white Americans or Europeans or people of European descent. Again, it's a topic for a future lesson, but just presenting it here because it makes the Declaration, I think, a little bit more interesting and a little bit more complicated. Now, this section is going to be removed from the Declaration as it goes before the whole Continental Congress, and the southern states and the states that are heavily invested in slavery take offense to this. Okay, if you didn't know, 41 of the 56 men that signed the Declaration were slave owners. So putting this grievance into the Declaration is essentially saying that they're just as bad as the king is. So, of course, they are going to object to that language, and they're going to want that grievance taken out of the Declaration. And they're going to get it because we need the Declaration to be a unanimous vote. We can't have some colonies not agreeing to the Declaration. It has to be 100% unanimous vote on this Declaration. So it was taken out. Jefferson mentions it later in life. There's no written documentation about the debate that they had. But Jefferson is quoted as saying, "The cause probating the enslaving of the inhabitants of Africa was struck out in compliance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves, and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue it. Our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under these censures, for though their people have very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others." So southern states he specifically names are South Carolina and Georgia, but also says that northern states also were invested in the slave trade and the importation of slaves. So it's maybe not a slavery issue within their state or colony, but an issue of economics. Northern colonies had the banks and the shipping industry and the insurance industry, and those were all heavily involved in the slave trade. But more on that in a future lesson. It does provide an interesting question. What if the slavery grievance was kept in? What if in 1776 there was a movement to abolish slavery and really embrace the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and apply those to everyone equally? It's a great what if question. Jefferson said of the Declaration of Independence and of the American Revolution, "This ball of liberty, I believe, is now so well in motion that it will roll around the globe." And the American Declaration of Independence is extremely influential. There have been 120 similar declarations made by other nations after 1776. It's going to inspire other nations and countries to rise up and declare their own independence, and continue to influence world history moving forward. So some takeaways from this lesson. By 1776, the Congress had decided to declare independence from England. It was too late. We'd gone too far. This is what it has to be. Not everybody was on board, but they're going to lead the charge. A committee of 5 was selected to draft the Declaration, and Jefferson becomes the primary author of this Declaration. It contains many Enlightenment ideas, especially those of John Locke: life, liberty, and property, social contract, natural rights, things like that. Those are all very important ideas that are very clearly stated in the Declaration. The Declaration includes a list of grievances against the king, a very thorough list of grievances to give evidence as to why we are declaring independence. Jefferson did include an additional grievance on slavery, but it was removed by Congress to appease the southern colonies, and that the Declaration is going to continue to influence countries and spread democratic revolutions across the world. So there you have a nice breakdown of the Declaration. Understanding the Declaration is very important. It's very fundamental as a founding document here in the United States, but also a document that's going to have far-reaching impact for world events. Hopefully you enjoyed this video lesson, and I hope you learned something.